Wait for it, and we're live. Hey, all you crazy sci-fi and fantasy fans. It's time for your daily dose of shenanigans over here at the Blasters and Blades podcast. Just a couple of nerdy veterans and one chaos coordinator geeking out over our science fiction passions and fantastical fantasies. A place where magic is king, the sky is the limit, and space is the place. We are the podcast that puts the fun in dysfunction. So without further ado, I'm going to let our guest, Mr. Mark Morton, introduce himself to our listeners and viewers at home.
Hi, yeah, thank you, JR. I'm really glad to be here and looking forward to chatting with you. So, yeah, in terms of introducing me, well, I'm in Canada. I'm in southern Ontario, about an hour outside of Toronto. But I grew up in the sort of the geographic center of Canada, the Prairie Provinces. I grew up on a small farm, some decades ago, and I guess my my writing kind of goes into two halves. One half is before my wife and I adopted four kids, and the other half is after. And then there was the 15 years when we were actually raising those kids, and we didn't write anything, apart from school notes, things like that. So the first four books that I wrote were actually nonfiction. And then more recently, when the kids got older and I had more time again, I decided that I wanted to try writing fiction. So I wrote a novel, and it's a young adult novel, a dystopian novel, and it's called The Headmasters. And I've written another one, haven't yet sent it out to any agents or publishers, and I've started a third one. So that's more or less me in a nutshell.
Okay. And in the next part of the introduction, dear listeners, how we first found them. So his publicist actually reached out, and I'm certainly glad they did. We have a few publicists that found our podcast, and they send us appropriate authors when they come up, and we're happy to find people we wouldn't have otherwise found. So we're glad they did. With that out of the way, before we get started, sir, we have to ask you the religion questions. Are you ready for this?
You betcha. You go ahead.
All right. Star Wars, Star Trek, or Firefly?
Star Trek for sure. Yeah. I've actually never. I think I downloaded an episode of Firefly, but I've never watched anything more than one episode.
So, what is it about Star Trek that speaks to you?
Well, it's partly that it was something that I grew up with. I guess it probably the original series probably came on when I was, I don't know, 6 or 7 or something like that, and I loved it. And it seemed to me that as I got older and I guess a more sophisticated film watcher or reader or whatever, so did Star Trek. And I really like my favorite Star Trek movie is The Wrath of Khan. I can't imagine how anybody else would have any other favorite one. But I also really like the more recent ones with Chris Pine and that crew. I think it's amazing how much these current actors have captured the spirit and even the look, even the appearance of the original crew of the Enterprise. I think that's quite amazing.
Yeah, I like that too, and I think The Wrath of the Khan, it's the most when people talk about their favorite Star Trek, that comes up the most. I like the Chris Pine movies. I don't know. I like the reboot. The problem that you get into with Star Trek is the IP is so murky because two different companies own two different parts of it, and it makes it really hard to do anything with it. I wish it was better managed because there's so much potential that hasn't been realized. I don't know. Did you like the Star Trek Discovery?
Yeah, I got into that sort of after it was already over, and I also like Star Trek. What was the other one called?
Picard.
The one with Scott Bakula.
Enterprise.
Yeah, Enterprise. Yeah, of course. And I liked also the most recent one about Picard. I thought that was pretty good. I guess I hoped it would be better, but I watched it all. The other thing that I really like about about the Star Trek movies is that and the series is that they're not afraid to explore ideas and issues that are happening in society. Like I remember in the original series, there's the one where they encounter a planet where there's a race of people, and they're black on one side and white on the other side, and yet there's a civil war going on the planet, and it's only sort of eventually that Kirk and the others realize that these people are fighting each other because some of the people are black on the left and white on the right, and the other people are white on the left and black on the right. And it really kind of explores the absurdity of racism, and how tiny differences between humans can, we can explode them out of proportion sometimes. And I think all of the later series as well have really explored some really interesting ideas as well.
I think because it takes it out of our comfort zone where it doesn't feel like we're being preached at, you can
Yep.
take hard ideas in science fiction and explore them in a way that feels detached and not like you're taking sides.
Yep. Yep.
Um,
Yep.
I
Yeah, I
liked
totally agree.
I liked one of the
Go ahead,
ones on
John.
the Star Trek: The Next Generation they did. I think it was called The Measure of a Man, which was
Hmm.
they were exploring whether Data was sentient and had rights or whether he was just a machine.
Yeah. Yeah.
Especially think that's kind of pertinent in modern society as AIs are slowly ramping up all around us.
I
It's going
know
to be it's going to
it's
be something
very
we're going to have to
prescient.
grapple with.
Yeah, yeah. I think that episode too. Another thing I liked about that particular episode was I think it was Riker who they made. He had to advocate on behalf of Data, and at that time in the series, he was still kind of iffy about Data, and he himself didn't know if Data, was a sentient life being, and that sort of stuff. I mean, Riker wasn't one of my favorite characters. Data certainly was, and I think another great thing about well, especially the last few series of Star Trek, is I think it seems to me like the most interesting characters are the ones that are kind of like liminal. They've got a foot in two different worlds. So like Data, sort of android, but wanting to be human, and Worf being half Klingon and half human, and so on. Like there's so many of the characters, of the really interesting characters, that have two aspects of them, and I think that's what creates a kind of um, well, it makes them interesting characters, but it also means that they are interesting characters for other characters to interact with.
Yeah, I can see that. Um, I feel like for a supposed warrior race, the Klingons get the short end of the stick. They were
Yeah,
so poorly done. They were just like comic relief. We need a bad guy. Let's throw a Klingon in there, and then
yeah,
we let everyone whoop up on them. And if they're supposed to be this badass like warrior race, how is everybody and their brother whipping them around every time you turn around? I'm like, they become almost like a galactic joke, and they
yeah,
built such a intriguing and like warlike culture to them, and then they sort of nerfed them in game speak. They weakened them so much that they were just there as a shadow of what they were supposed to be, and I never really
yeah,
liked that. I felt like they were underserved in that respect.
yeah, yeah. And how they changed their appearance as well. In the original Star Trek, they looked kind of like Vulcans, if I recall correctly. And then, of course, they become much more Worf-like as the time goes by. I mean, I think in terms of enemies that they encountered, my least favorite would be Q. In the Star Trek Next Generation one, I just found that kind of hokey. Um, and my favorite enemy would be the Borg, because I think they did so much with that, and I think having Seven of Nine as again, as one of those characters who's sort of half human but also been raised in the Borg world. Um, I really really liked what they did with the Borg as a species, I guess. And I think that too, it says a lot about following the dangers. Well, I guess both the strength and the dangers of following something blindly.
Yes.
I think that people can find a lot of support in that if they need it, but at the same time, ultimately, I think it's not a good thing. You lose the humanity, and I think that's another thing that I really like about um, all of the Star Trek series and movies, is that they always they celebrate humanity. Like I remember Picard at one point, he says something like, what Hamlet once said, perhaps with irony, I say with all seriousness, what a thing, what a thing of is man, um, reasoning celestial, and etc. etc. And it's believable. You really do feel like Picard is the kind of character who would have those kinds of quotations at the tip of his brain, like I just didn't, as I was stumbling along there. Um, yeah, I really like that, and I think you're right too. Going back to something you were saying earlier on, like I think all of science fiction is really a way of exploring ideas that are current, in whatever era the science fiction is being created in. I was recently rewatching part of the original Dawn of the Dead, the zombie. Is that science fiction? I guess it's kind of science fiction. Um,
Horror counts
and
as speculative fiction, certainly.
Yeah, it's speculative, exactly. And it came out in what was it, 67 or something like that. But anyways, the race relations were such an important part of that. And yeah, it gives some distance so that people don't just automatically, go to whatever ideological um, end of things they would usually go to, and it allows people, I think, more freedom to explore ideas in a new way, maybe a fresh way.
Yeah, and in a way that doesn't feel. If you took the same idea about racism and you stuck it in paranormal, it feels preachy. It feels like you've got an agenda and you don't want to just tell a story. You take
Yeah,
it out of that and you put it on an alien planet with differences that aren't exactly parallel to ours. And
yeah,
suddenly you can think about it without your instinctive knee jerk reaction
yeah,
for tribalism. And I think
yeah.
that's something you get from fantasy and science fiction, speculative fiction in general, but
Hmm.
specifically
Hmm.
sci-fi and fantasy because it's so removed from us, but it's
Yeah.
still a question where you analyze the human condition. What exactly does it mean to be human? There's definitely room for that. I will say with Star Trek, when they first started as the TV series, they were limited. They basically their aliens were forehead ridge of the week, like whatever. But it was because they were
Yeah.
limited on budget, right? Like you can write a lot
Yeah.
more differences, be they visceral or whatever, when you're doing it on paper. When you've got to show it on the screen, you're
Hmm.
limited by the tech of the time. So the
Hmm.
way that
Hmm.
Enterprise and some of the other shows later on went back and explained why they look so different, I thought
Yeah.
that was ingenious. It was like
Yeah.
gene experimentation gone wrong, and it took a while to correct itself again, or
Yeah. Yeah.
something along
Yeah.
those lines. And I can
Yeah. For sure.
appreciate they explained it away without retconning it, so they
Hmm.
stayed true
Hmm.
to themselves. That took some creative genius to come up with.
Yep. Yeah, that's for sure. For sure. Um, just while I think of it too, the original series, Captain Kirk, of course, is William Shatner, and he got his start about 30 miles from where I am. There's a small city about 30 miles away from here. Um, I guess I'm in Canada. I should say 50 kilometers, called Stratford, and they have. For more than a century, or more than half a century, 60 years or so, they've had a Stratford Shakespeare Festival, and that's where he got his start. Was on the stage there before he went to Hollywood to try to make it big. And I heard a document. Yeah, it was a documentary about William Shatner once when I was driving home. It was done by CBC Radio, Canada's national broadcaster, and it gave me such huge respect for him because, I mean, he went down and tried to make it big, and he described how for years, he was like living out of a car and just didn't give up on his dream. Um, I just found that so admirable, and he's still kicking.
Yeah. It's always encouraging to see where just dogged determination pays off. So
Yep.
'cause you hope that can happen to you, right? That's
Yeah.
why
Yeah.
it resonates.
Yep,
So
yep. It takes determination and of course luck. One of those things we can control and the other one we just can't.
absolutely. All right.
Yeah.
Because we are polytheistic here on the Blasters and Blades podcast, Game of Thrones, Wheel of Time, or Chronicles of Narnia.
Game of Thrones. I'm a little more hesitant about that one. I mean, it seemed, because Game of Thrones is like this ongoing saga. Sometimes I felt like, oh, I've kind of lost track of the plot and who is this person and who is that and whose side are they on. It got a little confusing at times. But I guess that's, what blogs are for and things like wiki fandom things to sort of help one keep track of the plot. Um, I mean, I also I read the first in that series, in the Game of Thrones series, and I have to say I found it a bit of a slog, though. Like, to me, it just seemed like one of the few cases where the film version or the TV version of something is better than the original book version. Um, yeah,
Okay. I have not started Game of Thrones. Because I know we will probably never get an ending, I just don't
yeah,
want to set myself up for disappointment. I get if you're along for the ride from the beginning, why that makes sense. But I had only heard about like Game of Thrones after the HBO series. And so by
yeah,
then it was very clear that there was going to be no ending. So I just like, oh,
yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Maybe if he
And
writes the ending, I'll read it.
yeah, and George W. Martin or something.
George R.
He's
R. Martin.
getting George R. Martin. Yeah, he's getting up there too, and he doesn't look the healthiest at the best of times, I think. So, yeah, maybe he'll just die, and it'll just sort of be, that'll be it. It'll be a not a cliffhanger, but just we'll be left hanging, so to speak.
Yeah, the running joke is that Brandon Sanderson will write his completion as well.
Yeah, that's good.
Although Sanderson is big enough in his own right, I don't think he needs that anymore. So maybe it'll be
Yeah,
somebody else. My
yeah,
guess is he wrote himself into a corner because it was such a complex plot
yeah.
that he's not sure where to go with it.
Well, yeah. Who was I reading about recently that? There's actually he's another Canadian. Steve London is how I knew him, but his writing name is Stephen Erickson, and he started in Canada, went to UK and wrote there for a while. Got a huge advance, like a $12 million advance to write 12 novels, and his novels are just so complicated. I just can't keep track of them. All the characters. So I mean, I guess the novel that I wrote. What I tried to do was keep things simple enough that one wouldn't lose track of the plot, but at the same time, have enough pace that it felt like the reader was being pulled along. And maybe I just don't have the patience that some kinds of fantasy or science fiction require. Um, Although having said that, I'm just in the middle of just earlier on, I was outside in our backyard, and I was listening to uh, um, DeLillo's Underworld, which is like
Yeah.
40 hours of audiobook. So
Yeah.
yeah,
I
yeah,
think the simplicity that makes it easier for you to follow, because I mean, to follow a more complicated book, it takes some dedication, especially
yeah,
if you're reading in 5 minutes here, 5 minutes there on lunch
yeah,
breaks and whatever. I think
yeah,
that's why so many adults gravitate towards, ironically, the young adult reading. Is because
for
it's
sure.
simpler and it allows them in more bite-sized pieces to just shut their mind off after a hard day at work or
Hmm.
whatever, and not
Hmm.
have to break out a slide ruler to track, who's what, where. So
Yeah, I think you're right. And I did read just recently that like 50% of all young adult novels are bought by people who are older than young adult, not with the intention of giving them to their children or grandchildren, but just reading them on their own. And I hadn't thought about that, but I think what you're suggesting is an interesting theory that it's like yeah, it's not too onerous. You can sit down, you can read it on a bus, you can read it at lunch. Um, yeah, that's a really interesting idea.
some of the authors are able to do it where they layer so much subtext
Hmm.
that it's got
Yeah.
enough for everybody. I don't know if you've read any of Rick Riordan's. I'm not sure how you say his last name.
No, no. What
He
are
did
his
the
titles?
Percy Jackson series and the Percy Jackson and
Oh,
the
okay.
Lightning Thief. He does a lot of them where he involves basically young kids who find out they're demigods and they interact with the ancient
Oh,
pantheon.
yeah,
So
yeah,
Percy Jackson is Roman or Greek pantheon. I can't remember. He does one, the Red Pyramid, where it's Egyptian gods and goddesses.
Yeah.
They're not linked in any way, the universes, I mean, but like he just explores. I think he did one with Vikings as well, the Norse pantheon, but he just looks at like if that was real and they were still having kids and, you know, the machinations in the background, what that looks like. And it's fun. And
I think one of my kids is a fan of the Percy Jackson series. Yeah. But I didn't realize that he's doing all these different mythologies. So that's really cool.
Yeah, it is. I really enjoyed it, and like they gave the kids reasons to be away from the parents that didn't just do they're dead. Because I mean, at one hand, like you have to justify how a 15-year-old kid is being allowed to go save the world. Like, where are their parents? So of course you just kill them. Whereas Rick Riordan found ways to do that where their parents aren't dead. You know, in Percy Jackson, for instance, the monsters are drawn to the smell of a half-blood or a demigod. And so, you know, they have to go to special camps where they can be raised away from human society so they don't die. Well, ipso facto, their parents are out of the picture and they're sort of doing their own thing without, mom was just killed. Right. And I just, I can appreciate that. You know, as a parent myself, I don't like that all of the novels are, once your parent's dead, then you can have fun. You know what I mean? Like, it's nice to see involved parents.
It's not the best message. Yeah. Isn't the Golden Compass series of books, aren't they kind of like that too? Like fairly young protagonists. And I can't recall any of the parents being around in them. Maybe there's an aunt or a grandmother or something.
I think they were raised by extended family. It's been a while. I haven't read them in years. I read them as an actual kid.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it was 35 years ago that I must have read those.
Yeah. They are great. They are among my favorite ones, I think. And it's good writing too. Like it's you know, there's a lot of science fiction, like let's say Philip K. Dick, for example. I love Philip K. Dick's stories, his inventiveness. I don't think Philip K. Dick is the best writer, you know, in terms of making good sentences and prose. But he was an amazing thinker upper of ideas. But the Golden Compass series has some really gorgeous prose in it. That's for sure.
I think some of that is a product of the time, like when people are reading, because I've read some of David Weber stuff that was, you know, his style was very 1990s, and he still writes that way. I think once you develop your voice, it kind of most people stays. And I can read, I've heard people talk bad about it. I'm like, well, that's just how they wrote books in the 90s. And if you read something from the 80s, you're going to get a slightly different sort of style. You know, you got some authors that just have very distinct voices, like Clive Cussler writes very workman prose, but his stories are amazing. He absolutely loves diving because he always throws some like expose on the gadgets they're using, and I'm like, okay, we know you did your research. The stories are good too. I think some of it's style and some of it's just era when the author came up.
Yeah, I think you're right. Like, kind of like with detective novels from the 40s. You know, they all have a certain kind of style or feel, sort of that film noir feel to them. And the same thing with, you know, what they call the golden age of science fiction. It definitely had a certain kind of style, which I don't think is in vogue anymore. But somebody like Philip K. Dick. I mean, how many of his novellas or stories have been turned into films, and they're brilliant films, like Minority Report and
Man on High Castle,
Blade Runner. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I think taste evolve and change. So right now the trend is not to give a lot of description because you want people to be able to envision it themselves. I want all the description. Tell me what the blade of grass looks like. I don't care. I get why they do it. It's the same reason Master Chief never takes his helmet off in Halo. It's because you want to envision that it could be you. And the minute you know exactly what he looks like, well, if you don't look like him, that's not you anymore. So I get that sort of approach, but I think if you tried to write that style 10 years ago, nobody would read it. And I expect we'll go back the other direction at some point. And I honestly can't wait because I love the description. If you get it right, I should be able to like design the clothes based on what you describe. Like the cosplay should be really easy, right?
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting. I mean, years ago, decades ago, I took a course in Anglo-Saxon, like Old English literature, including, well, most of it was about Beowulf. And at a certain point, the professor said, uh, said to the class, "Tell me what does Beowulf look like?" And some people said, "Oh, I think he's tall, he's got blonde hair," and somebody else said he's got a red beard. And the professor then pointed out, well, he's never described because everybody has their own idea of what a hero looks like, and so that way they can imagine that kind of hero in their head. Um, and I wonder to what extent too. I mean, there must be a lot of writers that are writing with one eye, hoping that their novel or their book will be turned into a film. And I think, if you approach writing with that kind of cinematic mindset, it affects, how you describe things, for better or worse.
I think it's definitely, I've noticed a change with the rise of audiobooks. It used to be
Hmm.
everyone, you said after somebody spoke,
Yeah.
because when you read it, it just blends in. You don't think about it.
Yeah.
But if you listen to it in an audiobook, Bob said, Jim
Yeah.
chuckled. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? It gets a little more grating when it's read aloud. And so
Yeah.
then people try not to use it. And it's a blend, because then sometimes it's like, wait, who's talking again?
Yeah.
Um, so it's a balancing act, but I definitely think audio changed the game. So I have to imagine people that think that they'll be picked up in film, that changes things too. I've
Yeah.
just, when you look at the back end about like how the film industry works, I just accept that none of my books will ever be made into film, so I don't worry about it.
Right.
Because
Yeah.
even if they
Yeah.
option it, it doesn't mean they're going to take it to the next step.
Yeah. Yeah. That's right. That's right. Um, Yeah, and which do you prefer? Speaking of audiobooks, like, there's sort of the audiobooks where it's a single narrator who might change his or her voice a little bit, with the different characters. And then I read one. What am I? Oh, I'm reading the new novel by Robert J. Sawyer right now called The Downloaded. Or
Okay.
I'm listening to it, I should say, the audiobook, and it's got a whole cast of characters doing all the different voices. It almost seems like a play. Like, do you have a preference for one or the other?
I actually don't. The only thing I don't like is when they put too much of the sound effects in there,
Hmm.
where it
Hmm.
takes it almost like this to 1940s radio drama. Mostly
Yeah.
because I'm hard of hearing. Been around one too
Hmm.
many IEDs going off, so for me that clutter makes it really difficult to hear the dialogue. But
Yeah,
other
yeah.
than that, like I don't really have a preference. I just don't want it to be robotic,
Hmm. Hmm.
which is why the
Yeah, that's
whispers. What do they call it? The Amazon's doing where the machine reads it to you. Like I
yeah,
just
yeah,
I can't do that because it sounds too much like a robot.
yeah, yeah. I mean, they are getting better. I mean, there are voices now that sound very, very human, but they still don't have the right intonation and cadence and stuff like that. And I don't know, maybe they never will. But I hear what you're saying about, I don't want to have every, little sound, every shuffling of the foot or the sound of a salt shaker, things like that. I mean, that can get too much. Um, Yeah, and you mentioned. Well, I was also looking at some of your previous podcasts, and I think you did one on what was it called? Not military science fiction, but
Oh yeah,
mercenary science fiction. I
mercenaries.
think it was. Um, and I mean, what do you like military science fiction, or is that too close to maybe your own experience?
I actually do. I started writing in a VA, the Veterans Administration class. They had a
Hmm.
writing as therapy class. And I know a
Yeah,
lot of the guys, either they did it almost like it was memoir, and that was just too close to me.
yeah.
And then some guys did fantasy. I did enough fighting up close that fantasy
Yeah.
was just a little too visceral. I just couldn't do it. Whereas with
Hmm.
sci-fi, I figured, well, blaster bolts are going to plasma, it's going to burn the hole, cauterize the wound. So it's a little less gory. Reading more of it, I know that's not necessarily true.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I started with sci-fi just because it was detached enough. I
Hmm.
do enjoy mil sci-fi and do
Yeah.
enjoy military fantasy. I think military fantasy is an up and coming subgenre on the fantasy side.
Hmm. Hmm.
Both with like the Wargate Productions, which is modern military units get sucked into fantasy world.
Hmm.
I can't remember the author's name, but he did the Destroyer Man series, which is set World War
Okay.
II. A destroyer gets sucked into a vortex to an alternate Earth.
Hmm. Hmm.
I like those, but I also like what Mark Allen Idlehite did, which
Yeah.
is, what would happen if you took the Ninth Roman Legion that went missing in, Scotland, we think, and
Hmm.
you stuck it smack dab in the middle of Middle Earth.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so he has the unit get sort of sucked over, and then now you've got Rome in a fantasy setting in a way
Yeah.
that works.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I think both have value, and I like both of them, so I don't necessarily have a problem with it. Lately, I've been exploring. I kind of siloed myself just because it was comfort zone.
Hmm.
Years later, with plenty of therapy, I've been exploring more genres and subgenres. So, like, I've been
Yeah.
going back through the classics of sci-fi and fantasy. I reread all of Tolkien's stuff,
Yeah.
some of the classics like Philip K. Dick's,
Hmm.
Heinlein,
Hmm.
and some of the others. Frederick Paul.
Yeah. Frederick. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, I started reading some of the classics, and I can see where their styles are dated, but it's good to appreciate where you come from, because we stand on the shoulders of
Yeah.
giants, as they say,
Yeah.
when it comes to building a genre.
Yeah.
And you can almost, just because I've started like looking at the history and the progression, you can track on the fantasy side. It was Lord of the Rings, then D&D, Dungeons and Dragons sort of modernized it and brought modern takes on fantasy, and then we were
Yeah.
off to the races. I think some of the authors like Dick and Heinlein and Paul did the same thing on the sci-fi
Hmm.
side,
Hmm.
uh,
Hmm.
until you ended up with like Star Trek, where it inspired actual scientists to make actual science that was
Yeah.
guessed in the shows. So I
Yeah.
think Star Trek is credited with the most scientific inventions it inspired.
Yep.
I think in the late 2010s, there was
Hmm.
what do they call it? X Games, not X Games. There's a contest where they try to get new tech, and one of them was to
Uh-huh.
build the handheld tricorder that the doctors
Oh
use
yeah.
in Star Trek. They actually
Yeah. Yeah.
built one that worked. It was just very limited on what it could describe,
Huh.
because obviously, it's simple algorithm basically, but
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
took what could have taken a doctor, doing differential medical stuff, hours to go
Yep.
through books. It could do a lot quicker
Yep.
with a
Yep.
simple algorithm. You got Miguel Alcubierre, and I'm probably butchering his name, and I apologize, but he came up with a mathematical formula that said, hey, maybe warp drive is actually possible.
Hmm. Hmm.
Now, the problem with
Hmm.
that, his mathematical equation was it took all of the energy the sun put out in its entire lifetime
Yeah.
to do one warp drive junk. So obviously
Right.
not viable, but there have been other scientists who said, I could do that one better, took his formula, improved upon it with modern knowledge as we constantly learn new things. And
Hmm.
suddenly
Hmm.
it's a lot closer to real.
Hmm.
I know some
Hmm.
who think we'll never get to faster than light. I suspect we will. Battery technology is the great
Hmm.
bottleneck, but I
Hmm.
don't think it stays that way forever. I think we'll see
Yeah.
changes. And then the other thing is, you're seeing, as we learn more, we find out how much some of the guesses were right. Like some of the galaxies, you would have thought there's no way there are planets
Hmm.
like that. For instance,
Hmm.
some of the ice
Hmm.
planets like Hoth, like, oh, come on, it's all one temperature all around. And
Right.
then we started seeing with the James Webb Telescope a lot more of the world, and we're like, oh, okay, if it's not in the Goldilocks zone, yeah, it would
Yep.
be ice all the way around. Now,
Yep.
whether it could
Yep.
support life out naturally, another story. But I mean, planets didn't, and there's no way George Lucas knew that. I mean, that
Yeah.
wasn't even
No,
on
for sure.
anybody's radar when he wrote that.
Yep. Yep.
Oh, it's
I
it's
think same thing
fascinating.
with yeah with Arthur C. Clarke as well. I think a lot of the things, the technologies that he created for his stories, have come into being. Um, and I think we're kind of at the similar stage. You were mentioning artificial intelligence earlier, and boy, I have to say, I'm kind of afraid of the eventual impact of it. Um, I mean, I'm old enough that my grandmother was born before the Wright brothers took up their first plane. She was born in 1897, and thinking about how far we have come in basically a century and a couple of decades, it's accelerating even more. I mean, we just cannot even imagine what AI is going to be like in 15 years, 30 years. I mean, they say that, how does that saying go? That people always underestimate, no, people always overestimate how much technology will change in 1 year, but they always underestimate how much technology will change in 10 years. And yeah, it's just gonna keep happening, and I think it's maybe going to be an existential threat. To I don't mean that AI is gonna destroy humans, but I think it's definitely going to change what it means to be human.
Yeah, and I think so. Given we talked about what a measure of a man, that Star Trek episode,
Hmm.
I think most Android AI in body form is going to come with people with, I'm trying to say this is a family friendly show, more primal interests in mind.
Hmm.
A lot of modern tech has come around through stuff you wouldn't say in polite society. Hopefully, if you're old
Yep.
enough to understand, you're reading between the lines. So I
Hmm.
do
Hmm.
think, because that is such a primal motivator, I do think it will continue to inspire people to do more, which is going to
Yep.
constantly push that envelope. Because at a certain point in time, where does humanity begin and machine
Yep.
end? And I just don't know that there are any easy answers. The one that scares
Yep.
me the most as far as sci-fi goes, have you ever read or Total Recall by Philip K. Dix, or
Yeah.
seen the I
Hmm.
know Total Recall was actually had a different name. I think it was
Mm.
something about sheep's dreaming, I think was the
Oh,
name.
no, that was Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Total Recall was originally something Incorporated, I think it was called.
But the idea of just messing with people's minds, given
Yeah.
that some of that technology isn't that far away,
Hmm.
I don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah, and the idea of like creating false memories in people's heads too. I watched something recently that was about that. Maybe it was on one of the Black Mirror episodes or something like that. That's another series that I really like too. Is Black Mirror.
The short
Um,
story, I just Googled it real quick, was "We Can Remember It for You Wholesale."
that's right. That's right. Yeah. 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 And
Um,
there's been two movie versions of that, I think, haven't there? The original
yes,
one with Schwarzenegger and a more
they did a
recent one.
remake of it. I've watched both. I thought the original was better, actually.
Yeah.
Sometimes the remakes are good. I'm not necessarily against remakes. I do wish Hollywood would try new stories. There's so much out there for
Yeah.
them to choose from.
Hmm.
But we've actually come into, even back in the 80s, with some of the hypnosis and implanted memories, that when
Yeah.
the FBI was doing it, they got innocent people sent to jail. But I mean, we've already proven how fallible the human mind is and how susceptible it is to
Yeah.
suggestion. I don't know if I believe like hypnosis in the way you see it in the movies, where like, oh,
Hmm.
you're gonna do what I say, I own you now, whatever.
Right. Right.
Or even the Jedi version. But I definitely think it's
Yeah.
easy to convince people who have weak wills that something
Sure.
happened, because group psychosis is already a thing, which is
Yeah.
why that one scares me more, because I think it's more possible.
Yep. Yep.
uh,
Have you seen the Manchurian Candidate?
I've watched the new one and the original one. That was a
Oh,
scary one.
I
Was it
didn't know there
originally, I
was a
think, in
new
black
one.
and white? There's a new one, I think.
Black, yeah, black and white, and Frank Sinatra was in it, and oh, what's her name? I forget her. Angela Lansbury was in it.
Yes,
Um, and I liked it, and it also had those crazy close-ups in it, like you know, where you're kind of the camera's so close to Frank Sinatra, you're basically looking up his nostril at one point.
they
It's
remade it in 2004. I'm
okay.
trying to
Yeah.
remember who was in the 2004 version. It was Denzel Washington, I believe.
Oh, is that right? Hmm.
Yeah, I'm gonna pull that up.
Hmm.
Yeah, it was um, Denzel Washington, Meryl Streep were the two big
Hmm.
ones, and John Voight were in it.
Oh yeah, John Voight. Yeah.
But that
Yeah.
was another one that I mean, the Vietnamese in the prison camps during the Vietnamese conflict were
Hmm.
at some level doing it, base levels of that.
Yep.
I mean, I'm sure we were doing it too. And Men Who Stared at Goats was the movie about the CIA projects trying to use drugs.
Yep.
So it's not too far fetched that a government would try if they could.
Oh, for sure. I think anything that we can imagine, they probably tried or at least thought about trying. I mean, there's I think nations like North Korea are currently doing things like that.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, yeah. When I was going to ask you something else. What was it? Yeah, yeah. You were mentioning earlier on. You were talking about how your hearing has been damaged by hearing, one too many.
Explosions. Yeah.
I Yeah, yeah.
IEDs, improvised explosive devices.
I think just one of them would be too many. But
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
um, it's such a, I mean, that's such a different, like my father was in the Second World War. He was in the Air Force. He actually never went overseas. The war ended just before then, before he was going to get over there. But his uncle actually left Canada, went down into the States to Iowa, joined the American Air Force, and became a what do you call those ball turret gunners? You know, they're
Yeah,
like supposed
door
to have
gunner or
like
belly gunners, I guess.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And I mean, somehow he survived. But you know, in Canada we've been pretty lucky. I think, you know, we haven't been involved in a big war since the Second World War. I mean, a lot of Canadians did volunteer for the Korean War, um, but it's I guess, you know, I don't think I've ever actually spoken to somebody who's been, you know, in combat the way that you have been. It's like a different world.
And the type of conflict is different too. I know Canada sent some military members to the Iraq invasion in the
Yeah,
early war, but I
yeah,
think it was like less than 100 of them, if I remember correctly.
I think so. And I think they were supposed to be there as, you know, quote unquote peacekeepers. Yeah,
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 it was flight crews. I did a quick Google on
right.
your military. It looks like
Yeah,
they were support staff.
yes,
So that way
yeah,
they weren't directly involved. But
hmm,
um, I know because of the way dual citizenship works and because America and Canada are such close allies, that
hmm,
like some country, if you have a dual citizenship with some countries, at a certain point, upon reaching majority, they require you to pick one, essentially.
yeah, that's right.
Canada is a nation where we don't expect our citizens to ever have to pick, and so I
Hmm.
actually deployed with some guys that had dual citizenship with Canada as well,
Was
because
that right?
you know, one family member was, or one of their parents was Canadian, one of their parents was American. So I
Yeah,
think you have veterans that served in the more recent wars. They just didn't do it under the Canadian flag, I
yeah,
think.
yeah. I think you're right. Yeah, come to think of it, and of course, you know, during the Vietnam War, there were also conscientious objectors from the States who came up to Canada. I know a few people like that that came up here, um, and yeah, just trying to think more recently. I think in Afghanistan too. I think Canada sent some troops, but you know, it pales in comparison to the number of troops that the U.S. deploys in various places.
Yeah, Afghanistan was a place I'm glad I never went. So Iraq was
Yeah,
hot. It was like,
yeah, yeah.
I watched a 140-degree thermometer that maxed out at 140 explode because it got so hot it overpressured the
Jeez.
mercury, which meant it was at
Yeah,
least 150, according to my friend who was a chemist.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
one of the officers that I worked with, so technically we were friends outside of the military because I was a sergeant.
yeah.
But he was like, yeah, it had to be at least 150 for that mercury to explode that
Gee.
thermometer.
Oh,
But
I
in
can't imagine.
Afghanistan, there were parts where the helicopters flew support missions for where there wasn't enough air for the helicopters to fly. They just sort of
Hmm.
coasted over the mountain. And then when they
Hmm.
dropped again, there was enough air. Suddenly the wings were doing something. The
Yeah,
idea of
yeah,
being that high up where there's that little oxygen, I'm like, no, thanks. Give me the nice desert war any day. um,
yeah. Boy, oh
it,
boy.
it
Yeah,
definitely gives you an appreciation for what your ancestors went through, where things were even, conditions were even worse. Because my
yep.
grandfather landed on Omaha, or no, maybe it
Hmm.
was Utah. I know he landed on D-Day,
Uh huh.
uh,
Uh huh.
and because he was wounded at St. Lo, the battle there,
Okay.
and
Yep. Yep.
then because
Yep.
that's where he met my grandmother. She was a field nurse. It was love at first stitch, I
Okay.
guess.
Okay.
Um,
Yep.
but
And she was from France, or
no, 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 she was American too. They were both American.
okay? I see. I see.
Um,
Yeah.
Ironically, they're from the same, general area. She just went over
Uh
with
huh.
the Army Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, I think they called it.
Huh. Yeah. Yeah.
She's one of the American nurses that were in the rear, so she wasn't a forward nurse. She was in England,
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
we sent our people back from. But so like I've heard stories from my grandfather. In
Hmm.
fact, when I got back from my first tour in 03, he's the one who bought my VFW membership, the Veterans of
Hmm.
Foreign Wars.
Hmm.
It's an
Yeah.
American military group.
Hmm.
So I heard his stories sometimes too. He always told me not to get the Purple Heart. He called his the I Forgot to Duck Award. So that's a award for getting wounded in combat. I did not follow
Right.
his advice. Unfortunately, while I don't have a Purple Heart because I never applied for it, because TBI qualifies, traumatic brain injury from explosions qualifies, but it's
Yeah.
one of those ones where it's not as obvious, so you have to apply for it after the fact. And by then, I'm like, I'm
Right.
a civilian. I don't care. I'm just going to go about
Yeah.
my life.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's definitely a different experience from what they did compared to like the
Yeah.
conveniences we had. Like I could literally get in a firefight 4 hours later, be on a base and calling someone in the States and talking to them like nothing had
Sure.
happened.
Yeah, absolutely. So different than in the Second World War, where you're sending letters back and forth, and they might take 6 weeks
And then they're
to travel
censored.
across the ocean. Yep.
Although
Yep.
they
Exactly.
did censor the audio. I remember a couple times we were in the MWR's Morale, Welfare, and Recreation. It's a nonprofit that does like support comfort stuff for the troops.
Hmm.
And it supported the coalition as well, so all the other soldiers. But
Hmm.
they had a phone booth where you could go to use your phone cards or whatever to call home.
Hmm.
And if somebody said things they weren't supposed to, there was
Yeah.
someone listening. They just clicked, the line went dead, and everybody lost their phone call all at once.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
So
Gee.
it
Gee.
was definitely an experience. And I keep thinking about like applying that forward, how
Hmm.
chaotic it would be once now, like when you were in the field, like if you look at Master and Commander, he was a god of
Hmm.
his ship. Like nobody could tell him
Yeah.
anything because
Right.
command was months away, whatever. Now
Yeah.
take that to a spaceship where their 5-second delay, like, hey
Hmm.
Bob, no, turn right here. Like, how do you
Hmm.
fight your
Hmm.
ship when you have people
Yeah.
micromanaging you from the rear? That's going to complicate everything.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Yeah. You're right. Um, with I'm asking some questions that are sort of getting us away from science fiction, but
Oh,
if
it's
that's
fine.
okay,
It's
like
fine.
would you mentioned that you're a father, you've got some kids. Would you want them to, like, I know that in the States there's lots of families where there's almost like a tradition of every generation having some join the military. Would you want your kids to join the military too?
No. So I am
No.
one of those families that my dad, my stepdad, all of my grandfathers served, my great uncles served. In fact, one
Hmm.
of my great uncles was at the Frozen Chosen with the Marines. I heard some
Yeah.
interesting stories about him getting trapped behind enemy lines.
Hmm.
I have one of my maternal grandfather was at in the Korean War. My
Hmm.
paternal grandfather did World War II. I have some
Yep.
cousins that fought in Vietnam. So like I get like you can trace my family history. We came over, Handleys came over from Scotland.
Hmm.
They were an
Hmm.
Irish family, immigrated to
Yeah.
Scotland, stayed there for generations. They backed the Bonnie Prince during the Jacobite uprising,
Yeah.
1740s. And so when
Yeah.
you lose a rebellion, they don't call you hero and founding
Yeah.
father. They call you traitor, and they tend to want to hang you.
Yeah.
Um,
So
and
they left.
so they left. And so a lot
Yeah.
of them settled in America, and so like they've been in the military since the 1740s. We can trace it back at least that far. And
Hmm.
at a certain point in time, I'm like, I think the Handleys have done enough. It's time for the Smiths and the Joneses to do their part.
Well, yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think what it comes down to is I really believed that we could go over all over the world and like make the everything better. I've come to realize that change doesn't happen that way. Like I think if we want
Hmm.
to change the world, you start at home. You start
Yep.
with your
Yep.
family and then outwards to your community. And with the ripple effect, eventually you'll make big changes, but you can't look outside in. You have to look inside out. I think it's the only way to
Yep.
make it work. I think our founding
Hmm.
fathers knew that. I think they talked about not going overseas looking for
Hmm.
dragons to slay.
Hmm.
Turns out they were
Hmm.
right. And
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
are apolitical here intentionally so, but I think just the
Yeah.
idea that you look internally, like you take care of your family first. I think that's where you
Yeah.
make the biggest change for the better.
Yep.
So
Yep.
that's where I'm focusing, and I would hope my kids will as well.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I
Well,
mean,
it's
I'll
kind of like,
support whatever they decide, but
yeah. Yeah. Well, it's kind of like being, whenever you go on an airplane, they say, the oxygen mask will come down. Put it on yourself before you put it on your kids or whoever, because you got to look after yourself in order to keep yourself in a situation or a state so that you can continue to help others. Um, so yeah, yeah. I mean, I think we as humans we're here in order to help each other, but it's what's that expression? It takes a long time to turn a ship. You.
yes. And one of the things, so I didn't start off in the infantry. I actually enlisted into the Army as a watercraft operator, which I guess bosun's mate. My
Uh-huh.
first unit was Riverine Squadron. So we had Mike boats. If you've seen Saving Private Ryan, that
Yeah.
the boats
Yeah.
that are landing are Mike boats. We had modern versions of that, which were redesigned more for river patrols.
Yeah.
Turns
Yeah.
out the unit I was supposed to enlist into didn't exist. They shut down in 1974. Someone forgot to tell the
Hmm.
MEP station, which is the military enlistment processing site where you enlist.
Yeah.
And so I ended up in the infantry. But one of the things they teach you when you're going to the school to learn to drive boats is this concept called chasing the compass. So
Hmm.
where you're supposed to be on whatever your heading is. If you're off by however many degrees, when you try to correct, a lot of times you overcorrect and you end up
Right.
zigzagging back and forth, chasing, trying to get the
Right.
compass right. And the idea
Right.
is
Right.
go slow and steady, but I think that applies, more broadly to the idea that there is a danger in trying to overcorrect. Like sometimes
Hmm.
just the best way to avoid the accident isn't to slam on the brakes; it's just take your foot off the gas.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
it's interesting what metaphors for life you can learn, having done things in the military.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
So
interesting. I hadn't heard about that. Zigzagging. It's kind of like the idea of the pendulum swinging one direction and then the other, and
absolutely,
yeah,
it's the
there's
same
a danger in
analogy.
that. Yeah. Yeah.
So, all right,
Yeah.
so we're an hour in, and we haven't even talked about your book.
Oh.
So we got two more religion questions. We play the commercial, and then we're going to talk about your book.
Oh.
This was fun. You clearly have earned a spot to come back when we do these discussion panels, because this is the kind of stuff we
Okay.
do on those, and they're a lot of fun, and the fans like it, and you meet new audiences. So, but first, one of the crying shames of adulthood is they stop asking us what our favorite dinosaur is. So I'm going to ask you,
Hmm.
sir, what is your favorite dinosaur?
I like the Stegosaurus, if I recall correctly. That's the one with the tail that has the
Yes.
um, plates or spikes on it. I always thought that was pretty cool.
That was the one that had the tailpiece. Was named by a comic book or comic strip. They called
Okay.
it the Thugomizer because it didn't have a name, because they when they
Okay.
were doing the strip, they called the School of Paleontology or whatever at the
Yeah.
museum in DC.
Yeah.
And they're like, it doesn't have a name. So he called it the Thugomizer for whatever reason. And the science was like, well, it's been named. And they just went with it,
Sure.
which I thought
Sure.
was kind of
That's
cool.
cool.
All
That's
right.
very cool.
And because we are affiliated with the coffee brand coffee company, and we are civilized human beings, no longer are we knuckle dragging troglodytes. Coffee or tea, and how do you take it?
Uh, Coffee, but I have a love-hate relationship with coffee. Sometimes I'll just drink too much, and then I just feel awful for the next day. But at the same time, if I don't have a coffee in the morning, I also feel awful.
I can appreciate that. I take my coffee very seriously. That's the answer I would normally give.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, and I like coffee with chocolate soy milk. I find that to be pretty good. It's like a mocha almost.
Yeah, I mean, I like
Yeah.
mochas. I can see how that working.
Yeah.
All right, we're gonna play that beautiful
Yeah.
commercial, and then we're gonna jump right in and talk about this book.
Perfect.
In a world where magic is controlled by law and government, mages are both coddled and persecuted. Corey Monroe knows she isn't a mage, and her best friend is. Reality isn't always what you know. If you are looking for an urban fantasy with found family, an education-based magic system, and evolving storylines, try My Luck by Mel Todd, book 1 in the Twisted Luck series. Available exclusively on Amazon.
All right,
Well,
thank
that
you for
looks like a
sticking
good
with us.
book.
Yeah, Mel's is a nice lady too. Thank you
Yeah.
for sticking with us through that commercial interlude. Now we're actually going to talk about the book. We went far and afield. It was lots of
Sure.
fun. There's a reason we stopped scripting these interviews, dear listener. But all right. So first off, you've told us that this is a YA book. So clearly, that's your intended audience. Could you give us a summary of the Headmaster, like the synopsis, I guess?
Sure. Yeah. Well, it's set in Canada. It's set in Northern Ontario, in the middle of the Canadian Shield, so it's pretty remote. Lots of rock and trees and stuff around. And the basic premise is that sometime in the past, like 60 years before the main action begins, there was a kind of global disaster, and it appears that most of humanity um, has died, and the reason they died was because this global disaster shuffled the words around in everybody's head. It kind of dislocated everybody's vocabulary, so nobody could talk to each other, and this just led to chaos. But the other thing that happened at the same time is, in this one small community called Blue Ring, is what it's called. These creatures appeared, which are kind of like wood ticks, really big wood ticks or deer ticks, and they attach themselves to humans. And for about 18 hours a day, they control the humans. They control what humans do and think and even feel. But then there's about 6 hours a day where they have to kind of release their control so that they can process all the perceptions that they got through the humans during the day. And I guess the other part of the premise is that these headmasters that attach themselves to people, they get transferred from one person to another. You know, one person dies and the headmaster comes off and gets put onto a younger person. And when that happens, the memories of the earlier host get transferred as well. And this can be very dangerous because if somebody starts to think of their it gets reminded of the memories that belong to a previous host, it can cause like severe brain damage. But the protagonist, her name is Maple. She's kind of unique because she happens to have the headmaster that was originally on her own grandmother. And so she's able to get some memories back from her grandmother that belong to her grandmother in a way that doesn't harm her. And her grandmother came close to defeating the headmasters. And so that's what Maple does. She tries to take on and take over where her grandmother left with regard to defeating the headmasters. That's the basic plot.
Okay, well, I'm going to pull up the book cover so we can show that to listeners. So where did you get the idea? I mean, obviously it's pretty on the nose when it comes to covers. What made you decide to do it in that respect and not something, I guess, more up in the air? I mean, you pretty much spell out the whole concept right there with that cover in an image.
With that cover, yeah.
Was that intentional to be that on the nose?
Yeah, I wanted to create an opponent, a foe, an enemy that was like just totally repulsive to humans. I didn't want it to be like, a bipedal alien or something like that. And where I grew up in Saskatchewan, in the middle of Canada, the thing I hated most about being there were the wood ticks. They get on people and dogs and they start to suck out your blood and just horrible. So I thought, okay, wood ticks are like the creepiest thing that I can think of. What if I make them about as big as a plate, or back size? And, then they attach themselves to you and they've got these little tentacles that also go into your brain. So that was the original image, I guess, of the novel. I started with that image, and then the other part that I pulled into it was I wanted to create a situation in which it seemed absolutely impossible for the humans to free themselves from the headmasters. And part of the reason for that is that the headmasters can sense the motivations or the intentions of humans. So if somebody even thinks about trying to get rid of their headmaster will kill them right there. Just give them a shot of some sort of toxin. And what interested me about that was that, there's so many places on Earth and in North America and US and Canada right now where communities of people or individual people feel absolutely hopeless. Maybe it might be the inner city in some big cities. In Canada, we've had a history of not treating Indigenous people like First Nations people. I think in the States, the word Indian is still used. Here we use the word Indigenous usually. And there's a lot of hopelessness, or, in places where there's war and conflict and refugees and bombings and things like that. So many people who just feel like absolutely hopeless. So I wanted to create that kind of situation, but then I also wanted to find a way out, or a way out at least of this situation with the headmasters. And ultimately, their way out is through love. Like, that's kind of the power that Maple discovers. I'm not really giving anything away there. And rediscovering their identity, because that's the other thing about the headmasters is you don't want to think about somebody else's memories. You don't want somebody else's memories to come into your mind. And so talking about the past is not allowed. So everybody in the community, they've lost their past, they've lost their culture, they've lost their history. And to me, that's the way that lots of communities that have been historically oppressed, that's one way to recovery is by refining their identity, finding their cultural identity again. So those are the sort of things that I wanted to pull into the novel. One was a very visceral, big wood tick, and the other was this larger idea of hopelessness and getting out of hopelessness.
That's interesting that you describe it that way. So the GWAT era, so it's the early war, the global war on terror, which is what Iraq,
Mm-hmm.
Afghanistan sort of fall under. During the
Yep.
early wars, and I'm only speaking on that because that's when I was in. So obviously the military culture is ever evolving. So
Yep.
what it was when it was in the 1960s is different than it was in the Cold War, which is different than it
Mm-hmm.
was in the early war. So there was a lot of the Norse symbolism. And so the idea was that I heard a lot was, until Valhalla was a common expression. And the idea was that, as a men, we died twice, once when our body died, and the second time when people forgot us. So there's idea that as long as your story still lives, you're still sort of alive in the hearts of the people that remember
Mm-hmm.
you.
Mm-hmm.
And so the idea that you take that away, to me, that's almost as like taking the history is almost the cause of the hopelessness right there, because you don't have anything to build upon to feel proud of. Like when things get hard, it's easy to say, well, I'm a member of the Morton clan and we did X, Y, and Z, and how can I let that down? Whereas when you have nothing to build on, you have nothing to inspire you.
Yeah, that's very true. And in Canada, I've been to lots of the states in the U.S. Travel a lot, but I don't know about this. Like here on November 11th, we have Remembrance Day. In the States, do you have that as well, or is that called Veterans Day is coming up? It's this weekend,
Veterans Day is in November. Memorial Day is coming up.
Okay,
Memorial Day is
excellent.
where we remember those who passed away in conflict, and then Veterans Day is where we remember those that are still alive.
Right.
And the phrase Veterans Day is Armistice Day in Europe, I believe.
Right. November 11th at the 11th hour of the 11th month. Yeah, and the phrase that is traditional here is "lest we forget." We remember these people so that we don't forget them, and because if we forget them, then the same thing might happen again. Is that phrase also common in the United States?
No, I actually started hearing that phrase just because the writing community is so global. So, and I run the Galaxy's Edge, which is one of the larger military sci-fi fan clubs, based on a property that's sort of Star Wars, not Star Wars. But there's a lot of international military members that join, because you'll find that no matter what nation they served under, there's some commonality.
Sure.
As much as it sucks, I probably have more in common with the insurgent I was fighting than I did with the hippie that was protesting the war. And I don't mean that in a derogatory sense, but the archetype of a person that's going to grab a weapon and go defend their beliefs versus just talking about it. They're different mentalities, and I'm not denigrating. Ideas matter, right? I think, one of the things that because of that, I started getting exposure to like a lot of Australian veterans and European. And so they're still, the Commonwealth countries are still very much the lest we forget. It's still the Armistice Day kind of approach. The one thing I have learned is Canada and America, like we both speak English, but our English isn't the same English. And then it gets even worse if you talk about like the Australians. It's what's that? Two people separated by the same language.
Yeah, that's right. And where are you located? I don't think I asked
I'm
you
in
that.
Hampton Road, so Southern Virginia.
Okay.
Near all the naval bases.
To me, you have no accent. Like, do I sound like I have a bit of an accent to you? Or
I don't think you have an accent at all. I think Tidewater region of Virginia has always been a maritime town, and so it's always had people coming and going from all over the globe, and that probably affects it. I know if I go a couple hours west, I'll start to hear some really southern accents. A couple hours north, and we're getting some more of the northern accents will start to come up. I just think the pocket that is the Tidewater region is pretty neutral accent wise.
Yeah. That's interesting because it's had so many different cultures and languages come into it that it ends up being kind of a neutral. That's interesting. Yeah.
And I've been all over the South as far as like living in between college, and then I went to grad school in Pennsylvania. So I've heard lots of accents. I think mine is just neutral, although if I'm around people long enough, I start to unintentionally mimicking their accent, and I don't do it subconsciously. Because I remember my little sister laughing when I called her, and I guess I said something that sounded a little too Philadelphian when I was going to grad school, and she's like, "You sound funny." I'm like, I don't
Yeah,
know what to
yeah,
tell you.
yeah, yeah. Well, that reminds me too. In the Headmasters, in my novel, there's one character. He's called Eccles, and he and his community survived because they were down in a deep mine in northern Ontario, a copper mine, and so there was a mixture of people. There were the actual miners who historically actually have come from Newfoundland, and people in Newfoundland, they have a very unique way of speaking. Like I have difficulty understanding them sometimes. But there were also astrophysicists down there. Again, I'm talking about the novel, and people from South Africa and academics and things like that when this global event happened. And so, as the 60 years have passed, all of those accents and different vocabularies have fused. And so, Eccles, when Maple, the main protagonist, when she encounters him, he has a very, very unusual way of speaking. And I kind of like that idea of how language is always changing, not just the sound of it, but the words we use, the expressions. And I think we're becoming more aware of that because, we've now had audio recordings for, well, more than 100 years now, 130 years. And before that, of course, nobody knew that, because they just didn't have a record of what their great great grandparents sounded like. Yeah, so I find accents really, really fascinating. And even in Canada, I mentioned in Newfoundland, there's a different accent. And when I go back to Saskatchewan, I probably develop a little bit of a different accent or start to use some different words anyway. Um, like, what do you call this kind of pastry? It's a fried pastry with jam or something in it.
You mean like a donut? Or are you talking
Uh,
a strudel?
okay, strudel. Where I come from, we would call that a Bismarck. But out
Okay,
here in Ontario, they call it a jelly donut or a jam buster.
I've heard
Um,
jelly donut. We use that one too. I've never heard
yeah,
jam buster,
yeah.
but I like it.
Yeah, yeah, it's a good one. Well, yeah, it's got part of your title in it. Um, yeah, yeah, language is amazing. I mean, two of my first two of my first books were nonfiction, as I mentioned, and they were about the origins of different words. Like the first one was about the origins and histories of food words, and then the second one was about the origins and histories of words pertaining to love and sex. Um, and I just love that about language. So I think that's why I created this character named Eccles in the Headmasters, because I wanted to kind of explore what it would be like to have all these different dialects of English merging together.
There was some theories that with COVID and the lockdown and everyone just communicating online,
Hmm.
that we might start to see more of a homogenization of accents because everyone's talking to everyone from all over.
Yeah,
At one point in time, they speculated the old radio accent, the vaudeville accent,
yeah,
would take
yeah, yeah,
over, but that was never
yeah,
natural. That was intentionally inflected in such a way that it worked around the limitations of early audio, so it couldn't pick up certain
exactly.
tones. So they,
Yeah,
spoke in a way to avoid that. It was so
yeah.
unnatural that it was never going to take on. The idea that we might homogenize, I like the idea. You just
Hmm.
one humanity, but I also think we're so tribal that we'll actively like rebel against that concept. So it's fascinating to play with, which is why I like the idea where you're talking about
Hmm.
where you kind of blend it together, and then the others that were in that mind, now they weren't exposed to that, and suddenly they're
Yeah,
different.
exactly,
It's
exactly.
interesting.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the globalization of technology and media has certainly done a lot, I think, to homogenize English. At the same time, I think something that's happening in the other direction is, the continued rise and emergence of English in places like India and Singapore, where uh, I mean, now they call English in Singapore Singlish because it's so different that it's almost becoming a different language. Um,
They have that here too in the Southwest. They call it
mhm.
Spanglish, which is the
Oh yeah,
intersection of proper Spanish and English,
yeah,
and it's some sort of hodgepodge of the both. You see some of that with the Creole talk in like
sure,
Louisiana, like where two languages meet, and somewhere in the middle
yeah,
they kind of merge, where they cease to be one or the other and become a kind
yeah.
of compilation of the parts.
The pidgin, yeah, pidgin
Yeah.
language, yeah, like the Cajuns, right? Like the Cajuns were the Acadians who came down from Nova Scotia, after the War of 1812, because they were supporting the Americans, and the ones who were supporting the British here didn't want them here. So the Acadians went down to where Louisiana and along there and became the Cajuns, and that's why there's still that French influence in Cajun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they because we tend to be tribal, they tend to, I don't want to say breed true, because breeding implies we're like animals, but like attracts
Mhm.
like, and so you keep things going. Historically, most families you'll find, they might have a little bit of this and a little bit of that, but there's one or two predominant ethnicities because
Yep.
you tend to be attracted to what you're like.
Yep. Yep.
There's at a primal level, there's some sense of security in that.
Yeah, affiliation. Yep.
The affiliation. So it's definitely
Yep.
interesting. That's one of the things I like about sci-fi, is that you can
Mhm.
explore what that looks like. I think James S. A. Corey, that did The Expanse, did that well when he showed the evolution of culture with the Mars people and then the Belters, who were affected by their environment. So they were physically different and they spoke different. I think that's going to happen as we start exploring the stars. I think
Yeah.
it's inevitable. So I'm fascinated. I wish I would live long enough to see it all, because it's all
Yeah.
fascinating.
Who knows? I mean, I'm getting up in years enough that I'm thinking I probably won't live long enough to see, discovery of some sort of alien civilization. I mean, I don't. I think it's still a long, long ways away before there would be any possibility of contact. But I can imagine that somehow we could pick up radio waves or something from another star system or something. But yeah, it's hard. It's hard to know. And with going back to Star Trek, I mean, I don't think in the original series, I mean, all of the aliens they encountered, they just spoke English, right? Like there was never any attempt to sort of explain how all these different species spoke the same language as Kirk and Spock. But I
Didn't they
think
have
in some of the
universal translator was what they were wearing?
they did, but even that, like, how does that work? I mean, I know it's a science fiction show, and in one of the recent movies with Chris Pine, I forget which. I think it might have been the second one. Um, is it yeah, it's the Uhura character who is a linguist, and she's there to help translate things, because it's almost as if they don't have the universal translator anymore.
I think her ability to translate picked up nuances the universal translators would miss. I
Yeah.
think in the early Star Trek, they didn't really address that. Like, there's going to be room for misinterpretations because,
Yep.
the famous, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Reagan's "I'm a jelly donut" comment.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
he
yeah.
means he went to
It's been
Germany.
ein Berliner. Yeah.
Right. And, I took German in high school and college. So, like, I
Yeah.
get the nuances a little, everyone knew what he meant, but it's still kind of funny
Yeah.
looking back. That
Yeah.
kind of stuff is going to happen. And you put that in the middle of a trade or a war peace treaty
Mhm.
kind of thing. And suddenly those language barriers get to be a lot more significant because the
Yeah.
impact is so much larger. So even with the universal translator, there's still going to be mistranslations. You're still going to need
Oh,
someone who
for
speaks
sure.
the language. So
That's
I
so
think
true.
all of that is fascinating. So
Yep.
you
Yep.
talked about the protagonist and the antagonist in your book, The Headmaster. Or Headmasters. Are
So
the
did you say a bit more, or you just cut out there for just a second?
Oh no, I was gonna say. So you told us about the main character and a little bit about the headmasters, the actual
Oh yeah.
ticks. Are they a
Yeah.
sentient race that are doing this, or are they just acting on instinct?
They are so different that the humans that have the headmasters on them don't even know. They have a sense that the headmasters are communicating with each other during this 6-hour period when they aren't controlling the humans. But whether they do that just through images or have a language of their own, that's unclear. Again, I don't think I'm giving away too much by saying that at one point, one of the characters is able to sort of join the what do I call it, the shared mind space of the headmasters, and it seems like what is happening there is it's very immediate. It's almost like it's happening without language, kind of the way that I think my family, we've got dogs. I've got a dog below me right now. We've got a total of 4 dogs in our house, And I often think, how do they think? Like, they don't have language, and yet they can clearly think. They must be kind of just thinking like with sensations or perceptions, or I don't know how they do it, but that's how I imagine the headmasters communicating with each other, and it's very way that kind of is either below or above language.
So do you come up with a reason or a way they got there? Do you say, were they from, they outer space? Were they a mutated
Yeah,
whatever?
yeah. Well, the two things that I mentioned earlier on, like one is that almost everybody in the world starts speaking gibberish because their words become dislocated, except for in this small community in called Blue Ring, and that's because the what's that phrase? The center point, the point zero, ground zero of this catastrophe actually happens within Blue Ring because it's kind of a research facility. So everybody who was within the facility, they survived, and I think I vaguely kind of suggest that somehow it ripped open space time, and that's how the headmasters came in. So the headmasters, it's not like they came as an invading force. They probably don't want to be there any more than humans want them to be there. Um, but at the same time, they are brutal. They are brutal masters of the humans, and so um, the humans want to get rid of them. That's for sure, because they are just ruthless in how they treat them. The other thing about the headmasters too is that they seem to be eternal, like they never die. Um, And so I kind of have to feel almost sorry for the headmasters because they're they've been transported from somewhere else, some other galaxy or something like that, into the human world, and they'll never get back, and they will never die. It's like a fate worse than death, almost. Like I personally think that one of the worst things that could happen to a human would be to live forever. I mean, I just think that would be awful. I don't want to die, but I also think that living for eternity would be a kind of hell on earth, and that's kind of what the headmasters uh, are living, at least at the end of the novel.
So do you wrap it up in this novel? Is it a standalone, or is there going to be more about this?
I put in some, not exactly, I guess Easter eggs isn't quite the right word, but there are some things in it that, yeah, I could build a sequel to it. I didn't start doing that because it took me a couple of years to find a publisher for it, and I wanted to start writing again. I thought, well, there's no point writing a sequel until I get the first one published. So the second novel that I've written is very, very different. It's also dystopian, but it doesn't take place in the same world at all. And then the third novel that I've written is kind of historical. It takes place between 1918 and 1922, so the end of the First World War, and just a couple of years after that. And it takes place in two different locations. One is Winnipeg, Manitoba, where I used to live for a while, and the other location is in France. Um, and part of the premise is that I'm sure you've heard about this, but you know how in the First World War, many soldiers were terribly, terribly disfigured by shrapnel and things like that. And
Yeah.
they didn't yet have plastic surgery. And that's where plastic surgery began. But one of the things that they started to do to try to help these men was they sent them all to a hospital. It wasn't actually in France; it was in England, and there was a nurse there who started to create tin masks for them, and she would paint them, look at photographs of them from before, and she kind of gave them their faces back by creating these tin masks. Um, in fact, this is kind of alluded to in what's that series, Boardwalk Empire. There's a character who comes back from the First World War, and he's got this tin mask on half of his face, and I found that just fascinating because these poor soldiers who are, again, it's almost like a fate worse than death. They weren't killed, but they feel that they are so disfigured that they can't even go back to their hometowns. They can't go back to their families. Um, and then the other part too is I bring a golem into it as well, who plays a part in their not their rescue, but in trying to help them out. Anyways, I don't know how I got onto all that, but yeah, a sequel. maybe I would write a sequel to the Headmasters at some point, but wouldn't be for a couple of years, I don't think.
Okay. Did you? So I'm assuming then, if you didn't write it with the series in mind, it gave a satisfactory conclusion. If they read it, they're not going to be left with a cliffhanger. You
No, it
generally have to do that with TradPub, right? Just because you don't know unless you sign a contract for a trilogy.
Exactly. Yeah. That's exactly right. Like one of the launches that I did here, I did with a fantasy writer named Kristen Ciccarelli, and she has a trilogy. Her books sell really, really well, and in fact, her latest book that was launching with mine was on the New York Times bestseller list for that category of book for a few weeks. So she's selling, hundreds of thousands of copies in comparison to my, I don't know, I don't even know yet. I'm kind of afraid to find out. But she was contracted to write three parts of this one book. And I think that would be a very different kind of writing process, because you kind of have to wrap up each book, but at the same time, you kind of have to leave it open so that there's something for the second book and the third book to grab onto. And I don't know how. It would take me a long time to try to figure out how to do that.
That's the one thing when you write with small presses and with self-publish is, like, you can get around some of that because you could just write the whole series and then rapid release it.
Right.
And so I can't imagine having to wait years between books, even if you wrote them all at once, just because the process is what it is. So it's a different style. I want to say one thing TradPub does well from the author, from the writing standpoint, even when they do series, like generally speaking, like when I wrote a series, my first series is finished. It's there's even a box set of it, the Sleeping Legion series. But you couldn't start in book 3 and understand it as well, because it's intended for you to read it 1, 2, and 3.
Right.
I could probably pick up a third book in an arc of most TradPub novels and probably be able to understand, just because they had to do that, because you don't know what the library or the bookstore is going to stock. And so if all they can get is book 3, they might read that not realizing there's 2 books in front of it. So it's definitely a very different style.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that, I think even like, even the Harry Potter books, for example, I think, you could pick up halfway through the series and you wouldn't know everything that's going on, but the world would fill itself in pretty quickly, I think. Yeah.
Harry Potter is a hard one to compare because it became such a cultural touchstone that people who've never read Harry Potter know who Harry Potter is.
Yeah, that's right.
Which definitely changes the game.
Yeah. And so, she had a great, what's her name now? I can't remember her name.
J.K. Rowling?
Yeah, Rowling. She had a really difficult time trying to find a traditional publisher. I think she sent it out to something like 100 different publishers before somebody finally picked it up. So you can imagine if she had only sent it out to 99 and hadn't sent it out to that 100th, how different the world would be. Yeah,
I think that's what. So I'm in some of the writing group that I'm in, where we meet once a week, and we meet virtually, but because we're from all over the globe. But how did your writing go last week? What did you do? Like, what are you gonna do next week? And then we'll talk like writing topics. It just the community keeps you accountable to yourself, really, what it comes down to. And that's one of the things I've told the ones that are choosing to go. They want to go the traditional publishing route just because they've got lives and day jobs, so they think, oh, well, it's great if the TradPub does all that stuff for me. Is whenever they get these rejections, I'm like, just remember, like, Stephen King got hundreds of rejections. J.K. Rowling got hundreds of. Can you imagine now that that's a bestseller? Everyone that rejected that book is like, oh man,
kicking themselves.
It's just one of those things where it's not always about you. It's about the market at the time, personal agents' preferences. There's so many variables involved that plenty of good books never see the light of day.
Oh, that's so true. Like I always, I was just going to say, I sometimes in the past, not recently, but I've taught creative writing courses, and I always used to tell my students, you need 3 things to be a successful writer. One is you have to have some writing talent. Second of all, you have to, sit your butt down in a chair and write. And the third thing is you have to have good luck, because like you say, there are really amazing writers and really amazing novels out there that just didn't encounter that luck. And sometimes it happens after the author dies. Like I read oh, what was it called? It's a writer. He's from New Orleans. New Orleans. Confederacy of Dunces. Dunces was the name of the novel, and it's the only novel he ever wrote, and it wasn't published while he was alive. And then he died, and somebody found it and got it published, and it's become like this classic of Southern Gothic, I guess is what they call it. And poor guy doesn't even know about that, or maybe he does.
Yeah, it's one of those things where the good thing is technology makes it easier for you those books to be found by your progeny, I guess.
Yeah, that's right.
The idea of the trunk novel is more virtual now, or more digital.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But yeah, there's something to be said for the luck and the timing of everything.
Mm-hmm.
But I also think hard work, you can make your own luck.
Yep, that's right. I think you're right, and you have to believe in yourself. It's like any great athlete, baseball player, volleyball player, whatever. You have to believe you're the best, I think, in order to perform at your best level. Yeah, a lot of it is confidence and just not giving up, determination.
Really what gets most authors is they tend to be introverts, and on the writing side that makes sense, but when it comes to the business side, you kind of have to be extroverted. Because if you're going trad pub, it's all about networking. Like I as an independent author who writes for largely small presses, even though some of those small presses aren't very small, for the most part, like I can sit in my basement and hide if I wanted to, and do my thing as long as the stories are compelling. With trad pub, you kind of have to go to some of those physical events in real space and meet space, as it were, and so it changes things, and that's what gets a lot of people is they just they don't like the people, and I can appreciate that. I'd rather be in the woods by myself. I get it. Thoreau makes a lot more sense to me now in my 40s than he did when I was reading him in high school.
That idea of going back to a cabin in the woods, not in the horror sense, but Thoreau's Cabin in the Woods. I mean, with my nonfiction novels that were published more than 20 years ago now, I had to do some events like going to bookstores and do signings, and they were just agonizing. Like you're sitting there at a table and people are walking by you, looking at you. What are you doing here? I couldn't do that anymore. I just don't have that kind of whatever it is, bravado or whatever.
Yeah, I don't know. I did a lot of writing before I was doing author writing, just because I was a history major. When I was in undergrad, I was history, English with creative writing emphasis, political science with an emphasis on pre-law, and then I had a sociology major. My advisor told me that wasn't admirable. It just meant I had a failure to commit, because I had 4 majors. But I was on scholarship, so I wasn't paying for any of it. It made it a little bit easier to take all those extra. And I went to a school where there wasn't a lot to do in the town nearby. So like, what was I going to do but take an extra class? So I carried more semester credit hours per semester. I carried more credit hours per semester than most people took in a year, which allowed me to do all that. If it weren't for the war, I would have graduated with 4 degrees instead of 1.
Well, and that's the great thing. I think, I think being a generalist is a great way of being a writer, because, academics and scholars, they tend to just zero in on one tiny, narrow little thing. But I think, especially with science fiction, you have to be able to draw on so many different things, whether it's, Roman history or AI or all different kinds of things. That being a generalist, maybe that's not the best word, being a Renaissance person is
classically trained. I would say classical training. But all of my majors, because they were all liberal arts, were a lot of papers that I had to turn in. My problem was always like JR, we're absolute limit, because they have the minimum of however many words, but they'd always set a maximum because I always went over. Like I could never contain myself. I'm the guy that when I edit my novels, they get bigger. So because I'll fix one thing and then I'll have to explain what I fixed, and then before I know it, my 80,000 word, when I'm done editing, it's 125,000. Sorry to my publishers. But so like I think that the practice helps, I think, coming into it. And then with speculative fiction, I think understanding people is the key. And people, I don't think you'll meet a single author that isn't fascinated by the human condition in some
Yeah.
aspect or another.
Yep, exactly.
And all of those degrees, the English degree, the political science, the sociology, and the history, all of those are studying people just from different angles, but they're still, it's a study of humanity. I think that's why I like speculative fiction, is because you get to look at people and see what that might look like.
Yeah. Yeah, it's almost like psychology or sociology in motion, sort of, imagining these different situations or cultures. Yeah. The experiences you had in Iraq, did you ever turn that into a memoir or anything like that?
So I have written the story. So when I do my newsletter, so part of my branding is that, the combat veteran, because I write mill sci-fi mostly. I'm sort of broadening my horizons as far as what I write. But so the branding is still combat veteran who writes the everyman warrior, right? Because that's ultimately all of my stories have that. And so at the end of every one of my newsletters, I tell a funny story about time in the Army. Most of the ones that I tell are the ones that I feel safe telling, because some of the stuff is more personal and I just won't.
Yeah.
Some of the stories that I write down for my kids when I pass, it's I couldn't publish that because some of my opinions would get me sued. I have certain opinions on some of the people I served with.
Yeah.
Some of the unions, mostly the higher ups, and how the war was managed. And so I've got an uncle that's a lawyer, and he's like, yeah, maybe wait till you're dead and let your kids publish it, because they can't sue them and you're already dead. But I do write them down, and I incorporate a lot of that into the way I write combat. Like, so when I wrote one of my novels, The Reservist, I literally locked myself into a hotel room. I had the documentary. It was drawn a blank on the Long Way Home, I think was the movie was called. It was a miniseries about a unit in Iraq that got lost and then ambushed. That actually happened right before I went back for my second tour. And they were doing the same kinds of missions that I was doing, fob jumping. So I had that in the background, a bottle of whiskey and a keyboard, essentially, and I wrote that novel. And it shows it was very visceral. I don't think that's the healthiest. The Hemingway approach is the healthiest for a long career as an author, but I definitely excise some demons into my fiction. And so I do try to remember the good things, because for all the war sucked, there was something beautiful about the base culture that is Mesopotamia, that is Iraq. They're very friendly. They have a very welcoming to guests. I've said before, I honestly think if Hitler walked into their town as a guest, and they'd sit down and have dinner with him like he was their best friend. Now, once you're no longer a guest, all bets are off, and they'd probably shoot him just like we'd want to. But I mean, the hospitality culture, I mean, they were just very friendly. It was really easy for people to forget that those were people too that didn't ask for us to be there, because people were angry about 9/11. They were, angry they had to be there. But the people on the ground were just as caught up in those events as we were. And so it was definitely an interesting experience seeing the world. My undergrad history degree was originally focused on ancient and medieval history, which in retrospect is a really big area of time. But so to stand in Mesopotamia, where it's the most quoted land region in the Bible, that region. So basically you're standing in the footprints of history, and there's something surreal about getting to do that. I really do hope they manage to find peace so I can go back and take my family to experience some of that.
Well, that's where the Epic of Gilgamesh was written in that area, wasn't it? The Sumerians?
It was. And I have I've stood on top of the ziggurat of Ur, which is one of the oldest structures. It predates some of the Egyptian pyramids. At one point in time, it had opening on the side, on the four corners. There's front and back, if you want to call it that, there were steps, and on the sides there were sort of entranceways to the internal priestly areas. At some point in time, they closed it up. The tour guide told us, the guy that was the local, that was our interpreter, told us that that's where Abraham was born, the town of Ur, and the rumor was he was buried inside of it. Even when I say old and new, we're talking the new is thousands of years old. But you could see the difference in ages of the old and the new stone, just because they've been extra 1,000 years or so of weathering. When you got to the top of it, you could see the stains from the copper from all the blood sacrifices that happened up there. I don't know if they were sacrificing humans or sheeps, but I mean, human or blood has copper in it, which iron, which stains the rock. And if you do it over enough time, you change the geology of the rock.
For sure.
So it was just fascinating to stand there to see, something so old, which is, in America and in Canada, like most of our stuff is relatively new. There were people that
Yep.
were here as old as the castles and whatnot,
Mm-hmm.
but they were living more in touch with nature, so they didn't leave those huge edifices of their existence. And so, to see something that's literally that old is just kind of hard to fathom at some level.
Yep.
That's why I
for
think
sure.
the colonization stories in sci-fi, where you get the ancient artifacts of lost civilizations they find, that's partly why it appeals to me, because it seems so foreign from what we experience on this continent, right? Like we have to go to Central America before we find any evidence along the lines of what you could find in Europe,
Yeah, with the pyramids there, for sure. Yeah,
and we're finding more pyramids even still with a LiDAR that we can do aerial now.
In the Amazon there.
Yeah, so they're finding lost temples or towns and stuff. So, wow, we've been way far afield. I thought we'd spend the next half hour of the book just talking about the Headmasters, but you're fun to talk to, so we've been all over the place.
No, I've enjoyed this.
One thing I did learn, because I'm a fan of the classics of science fiction TV in the form of Stargate, is that all alien planets do look like Canada. So, I mean, you do have that going for you if you ever go to the stars.
Well, that's good. That's good to know. Well, also I've always thought with like I like zombie films. My eldest son and I have watched, I think, every zombie film or series, including The Walking Dead. And one thing about The Walking Dead that struck me was, why do they stay down there in Georgia? Why don't they come up to Canada, where the zombies would surely freeze, and then while they're frozen, they can whack off their heads or whatever? It just seems like an obvious thing to do to me, but who knows?
I saw that in one franchise where they dealt with zombies. That's what they did. They went to the cold regions because it slowed them down to the point where they were, you could either get away from them because they're moving so slow because they're rotting and decaying, or they just couldn't exist, right? So like I don't know. I did question why they stayed there. On the other hand, if you're trying to grow your own food, you do kind of need climate that cooperates.
Well, that's true too. Yeah,
and that's one of the things. They had a reality show, and reality shows are air quotes around reality, called the Colony, where basically you take a bunch of people and they live in some fake post-apocalyptic world, and they were scavenging for food, and it's a documentary on what if, right, for post-apocalyptic sort of. In this one, they were going for a nuclear holocaust, essentially, that destroyed the world. But you do learn that at a certain point in time, gas becomes unusable. It doesn't have an indefinite shelf life. At a certain point in time, the gaskets and seals are going to die off. Reactors are going to shut down, and the Great Sierra deserts are going to come back. Like, we don't realize what a difference we make to the environment. And so the idea that you could just scavenge indefinitely and survive, maybe not.
No.
For instance,
there's
there's
a great series. I think it was the BBC that made it, and it was like 6 episodes. The first one was called 10 Years Later, and then the next one was 50 years later, all the way up to like 5,000 years later. And it was about what the Earth would look like 10 years after humans ceased to be, and 50 years after, and so on. And it was fascinating. I should see if I can find that again. Like, one of the things that humans make that will last longer than anything else, apparently, are toilets, because they're ceramic and they don't have any cracks in them. So they will last perhaps, as long as the pyramids.
The series is called Life After Humans. I've seen it. It's a fascinating. It talks about one of the things you don't think about of like some of the domestications of animals that we've done and how quickly they would revert, because we bred them to do very specific purposes. And in modern society, we breed them because we like the breeds now. We don't necessarily use them for their intended purposes. But you take humanity out of it, and essentially dogs become wolves again.
Yeah, exactly. Dingoes are feral.
Yeah, and so the one that would be the most effective on nature is twofold. If the Hoover Dam stops, the great deserts in that region will go back to being deserts, because it's unnatural the way it is. We have to artificially bring that water. And then two is, we have, just by virtue of humans being there, we've started building and changing the the weather around Nevada in the Las Vegas, because there's so much people bringing water. They're using the bathroom.
Right.
They're bringing moisture, so you're getting grass growing where if humans weren't there to constantly bring the water that then gets trapped, like that would be desert too. And so
because it was desert until, was it Bugsy Siegel went there and built it?
And so it stayed desert even still. It was just air conditioned, let them do a lot, and we would just bring stuff in. But you keep people there long enough, and the water just starts changing things again, essentially terraforming it, I guess.
Right.
So you take humans out of that, and stuff starts reverting. You don't have dam management. Essentially, lakes and rivers revert. There's a lot of things that would change.
What was it called again? You said it was called Life After. Yeah, I'm going to find that again.
It's really good. I've watched that. My son, my youngest son, is autistic, and he was nonverbal for a while, but he likes documentaries because facts just fascinate him. Like when other kids were reading superheroes, he wanted books of like 1,001 random facts. We watched that together, and it really was kind of interesting. It's stuff you didn't even think about. Like it never occurred to me about the dogs, for instance, of how that would change. Or what grass would grow over and what would remain. I was kind of surprised at some of the stuff that would remain. Obviously the joke about cockroaches, but some of the foods that we eat, like Twinkies, for instance, that would survive a nuclear. And then I'm like, oh man, now I don't want to put that in my body anymore because holy crap, when they started talking about some of that stuff.
Boy. There's so much to explore, through the imagination when it comes to speculative fiction. Just I think we haven't even begun to really tap everything that we can imagine and write about in terms of stories and science fiction and so on.
So you mentioned the novels that you write. Do you ever write short content?
I haven't. Well, that's actually I do. And just yesterday I sent out 2 short stories, but they're not science fiction. No, they're not science fiction exactly. They're kind of speculative, I guess. But I haven't published any short fiction in 30 years. But I'm hoping to, because sometimes I feel like, oh, I just can't sit down right now and work on a novel. But I could probably start to write a short story. Different kinds of energy. Let you do different kinds of things.
Yeah, I did for a while. I just was stacking short stories, so I have a bunch that are slowly getting published. But when I was going through, so I had to have some shrapnel removed from my thigh, and then there's the rehab and all of that. And so when I couldn't sit still for very long, but I could dictate, I could do short stories because they're shorter, and you still get that sense of completion, which is its own sort of drug. And so I've got a bunch of those, but I love short content because that's what I grew up reading. Do you remember the Reader's Digest version stories?
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Well,
I grew up.
I was what you call a tag along, which is basically means the non-Girl Scout member siblings that would go because my mom was the scout leader. So when my sisters were doing their thing, I was reading Reader's Digest novels of like some of the classics like Pirate Island and Peter Pan and all the classics of kids literature. I started reading shortened versions of it. So for me, like I love short fiction because it's a good way for people to discover what they might not have otherwise tried. So I'm kind of, I just wish there was more money in it.
That's for sure. Well, just last week, or maybe less than a week ago, Alice Munro, one of the greatest short story writers, she died. I think she was like close to 90 or something. And she also lives about 60 miles from here. She's Canadian and always lived in the same small town in southern Ontario. And I think she, along with Flannery O'Connor and Hemingway, Mavis Gallant, they just mastered, and Chekhov, mastered the form of the short story.
Yeah, so when I do short content now, my goal is to go to the bottom end of instead of, begging them to give me the few extra 100 words, I try to see if I can get it even more succinct. So if they say 6 to 10,000 range, I'm going for 5. So when I edit it, it's at 6, just to, plus your skills. But it's fun to do. So,
and flash fiction too seems to have become a genre on its own, like 200 words or less.
There's a publisher called Raconteur Press. that does what they call postcard anthologies, where they give you a picture and you write like a micro story about the picture.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't have that kind of level of succinctity. Like
Mm-hmm.
I've never met a short story I couldn't turn into like a 12-book arc. Like,
Right.
I have the opposite problem.
Right.
But I admire those that can do it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You've probably heard this, I think Fitzgerald said to Hemingway when they were in Paris, he said, I bet you can't write a 6-word short story. And Hemingway went home and he did. He came up with for sale, baby shoes, never worn.
Ooh.
That's a short story right there. Yeah.
And anybody who's got kids, there's lots of implications of that never worn.
Yeah, it hits hard.
Yeah. Wow, that's good.
Yeah. Yeah.
I would generally, if someone did that, tell something flippant, like I'm from the IRS, here to help, which is our internal revenue services. They've kind of got their own mythos here because it was the IRS that brought down Al Capone, not the FBI.
That's right. Yeah, his accountant. Yeah.
Yeah. So the microfiction, I don't have the skill for it. I prefer more in-depth stories, so I don't even really read it. But I can recognize that it's a craft style in its own right for people that do it.
Yeah, it's not just like it's not like just a novel shortened. I mean, it really is a different genre.
Yeah, and it's at some point in time, they're almost in line with haikus without the rhyming, right? Because you're limited severely on the storytelling. But that means like one of the books I wrote called The Vacuum Sucks Hard, The Adventures of the USS Big Stick was tongue-in-cheek sci-fi. It was supposed to be a sci-fi short story anthology. I was told my humor was too barracks humor and not what they were looking for, but I couldn't let the story go. So I ended up turning it into a novella. I co-wrote it with a friend of mine who was a Marine because I had to get the barracks humor. It was bad when you went to a Marine to get the humor toned down a level. So that way it was a little bit more palatable.
Right.
But when we would write, like I would try to make every line do sometimes double, triple, quadruple duty with layered meaning. And I realized, one, it was fun to do, and two, never again, because it's so much extra work. That I respect those that can do it.
Yeah, it's like carving a diamond,
Absolutely. Or the guys that write the words on rice.
Yeah, exactly. Like little poems on rice. Yeah. And Dickens on the other end, forget what critic referred to his novels as loose, baggy monsters or something like that.
If he got paid of course he was wordy.
By the word, yeah. And he would publish a chapter in this week of the magazine. I don't know how he did that without computers and not being able to go back and revise. It's just beyond me how he did that.
Yeah, I shudder to think about what school would have been like, because when I was a grad student in an undergrad in college, we had word processors. So like I had Word, I could go and type it up. I could do edits on the fly. I could do the footnotes.
Yeah.
I can't imagine doing that on a typewriter where you mess up, man, because I can't think of all the mistakes I made and went and edited. Like having to redo that whole page. And if you change too much, now you've got to redo everything after it, because now the pages, like I shudder to think.
Yeah. My first university essays were mechanical typewriter, and trying to add footnotes at the bottom and not leaving enough space. It was horrors. Yeah, we're lucky now.
Well, we're almost at 2 hours, so I better wrap this up. We're gonna have to have you back. This was a lot of fun.
I really enjoyed this.
Speculative fiction memory lane was just worth its weight. Where's the admissions fee, I guess? But what are you writing now as we leave the listeners?
Well, the novel I was referring to before about that's taking place at the very end of the First World War in Winnipeg in Canada and also in France. That's what I want to get back to. I've left it for about a month because I've been trying to send out some queries to agents, and that just takes a long time and a lot of energy as well. But I'm hoping to get back to that novel. This summer anyway. It's about half done.
And we'll link all of this in the show notes. But how can listeners and viewers find you on the Wild Internet?
Probably the best thing is my website is markmorton.ca. So not com, because I'm in Canada.ca. So markmorton.ca. .ca. Oh, and my last name is Morton, and okay, I just mentioned this in passing because it's kind of funny. Sometimes I'll get emails or letters from people, and I assume it's by accident, they'll leave out the T in my last name, and it's an important T because it's the difference between Morton and moron. So
I actually, when I was going through AIT for my third MOS, we had a sergeant who pronounced it Dumas, but it was spelled dumbass. And I can imagine how he must have dealt with that as a trainee when he couldn't get even. So yeah, I can appreciate sometimes word similarities could be a problem.
yeah, that's funny. That's funny.
This is the part of the
interview. Thank you, JR.
Absolutely. This is the part of the interview, dear listener, where I remind you to please be kind and speak your mind on the reviewing platforms. Your reviews help the right readers find the right books. So do your part and help a reader out and help your fellow reader discover new and amazing works. And you can find us on our Linktree, linktr.ee, Linktree / Blasters and Blades Podcast. Again, Linktree / Blasters and Blades Podcast, where we link to all the things, the BitChutes, the Rumbles, the YouTubes, the TikToks, our Twitter. We have our email, Blasters and Blades Podcast @gmail.com for professional purposes only, people. We have our Blasters and Blades Facebook group and Facebook page. And we have Madam Stabby Stab on the Instagram, Twitter, and email. Send all the shenanigans her way. She's here for it. We also link on our Linktree to our website, which is now over on Spotify, with a lot of gobbledygook. So it's easier just to click the Linktree, link people, and follow us to Spotify, where you can support the show for as little as 99 cents a month. Your contributions help keep the lights on. These episodes aren't free to produce, and we appreciate your patronage. Speaking of patronage, you can support us more directly over at buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Again, buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Be sure to put in the comment section that is for the podcast. And I promise I will keep my co-hosts duly caffeinated. They will drink until they run out of coffee brand coffee, and then they'll use our discount code podcastgrunts for 10% off, and they'll get more, because that's how we roll here, people. And with that, thank you for spending some of your precious time with us. For my absentee crazy co-hosts, I am J.R. Handley, and this was the Blasters and Blades Podcast. We'll be back next week at the same time, where we'll indulge our love of nerd culture, cheesy jokes, and all things that go boom. Thank you for coming by, Mark. This was a lot of fun. We're definitely having you back. This was fun.
Thank you. Thanks so
all
much.
Right, with that,
Bye-bye.
We are out.